please note there's a content warning, sensitive content warning on this conversation. So we're going to start with the acknowledgement of country. Let us acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're gathered on. We acknowledge our gratitude that we share this land today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, our hope that we can move to a place of justice and partnership together. Today, we are very excited to have Merewyn, Executive Director at Hagar International. Hagar is an internationally renowned leader in recovery services for survivors of human trafficking, slavery, and abuse. Hagar's objective is to free and heal communities of the trauma associated with trafficking, slavery, and abuse. Today, Merewyn will talk about Hagar's work in Afghanistan since it began operations there in 2008, supporting women and children facing the worst forms of gender-based violence and human trafficking. ACRATH supported Hagar's worldwide appeal last year, and after the US and allied troops withdrew from Afghanistan and the Taliban took over the country, well, control of the country, rather. We're proud to continue ACRATH's long association with Hagar as we explore Hagar's work on the ground in Afghanistan in this conversation. And over to you, Cindy and Merewyn.
Thank you, Ange.
Thanks, Ange.
Sorry, I'm just doing the technology behind the scenes. So, Merewyn, it is exciting that we're talking, even though I suppose the content's pretty, it's hopeful, but we will go to, as Ange said, there will be bits that could be a little bit, I suppose they're very sensitive. So let's look after ourselves as we do in this work anyway. But thanks, Ange, for that sensitivity, that warning. Merewyn, thanks. Let's dive in. Tell us a little bit about Hagar.
Thanks, Cindy. So Hagar started as a grassroots organisation nearly 30 years ago in Cambodia, so perhaps somewhat different to other agencies in the sector. We started nearly 30 years ago by a really visionary founder who came across post-Civil War Pol Pot regime, came across a woman who had been thrown out of the home where she was actually a domestic slave, and she and her young, very newborn child were on the streets. And our founder came across her and couldn't walk past her. He needed to stop it and provide support. And that started what then became Hagar. And he started, his way of supporting her really informs the way we operate today, which is our flagship approach to how we work, we describe as the whole journey. So we journey with survivors doing whatever it takes for as long as it takes. And Pierre started by providing shelter for this woman for one night, and then recognised that she needed to be able to maintain her own independence to then sustain a level of livelihood that she needed. So he supported her finding work. And again, that's also reflective very much of how we work with survivors. So we support from the most acute need of their most acute emergency needs, whether that be emergency accommodation or medical support when survivors arrive to us, right through to intense psychosocial counselling, legal support through the legal process to seek justice, right through to economic empowerment to enable people to reach a point of independence, and support them in their healing of trauma through that period of time. So we started in Cambodia. We then extended working and continue to work in Vietnam, in Myanmar, in Solomon Islands, in Singapore, and also Afghanistan.
Wow, Merewyn, it's phenomenal. Like that, the founder, like so many of us are sitting in on this screen, and we've all worked for someone who has set up at ACRATH now, but also in our other experiences. There's been a founder, and their philosophy and strength has just, it permeates, doesn't it? So tell us a little, take us, say, to Afghanistan. If I was to visit Hagar in Afghanistan, what would I experience?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're big questions.
That's a big question, isn't it?
Sorry.
No, that's a great question. Perhaps I'll set the scene a little bit, perhaps back in August last year, because how we are and the work that we're doing now is really evolved significantly since pre-August and the fall of Kabul last year. So at that point last year, before the Taliban took over Kabul in August, we were running a couple of really key programs. So we've got 100% of our staff, of our 50 staff on the ground, are Afghan nationals, which is quite unique, I think, and has actually placed us in a really strong position to be continuing the work through some really difficult times over the last 12 months. And our staff there work predominantly in Kabul, but also in some regional areas on the outskirts around Kabul, running two key programs. So we've got a Forgotten No More boys shelter, where we support anywhere between 20 and 30 young boys under the age of 18 who are survivors of slavery or trafficking or abuse. And perhaps the name gives a bit of a hint as to how we feel that work really is. It's really about supporting boys in a community that otherwise they would be quite completely ostracised by their families and their communities because of their experiences. And we support them. It's a shelter facility, unlike anywhere else. In any of our other countries where we operate, we don't provide a shelter facility, but we need to, because these boys are often ostracised from their families and communities. And we provide their physical needs, so shelter and food, but as well as their educational needs alongside of social counselling to support them with their healing. At that point in August, we were also delivering an economic empowerment of women program across a couple of different regions, which, as you can imagine, with the fall of Kabul, needed to cease immediately. And through it's a really intense time for our staff in August, where people needed to they physically couldn't visit the office, they couldn't work there, they didn't know if it was going to be safe for us to continue our work. The team, with support from the Global Federated Partnership, actually rebranded to ensure that we were very clearly quite neutral in any communication. That included all of our communication about the work we do in Afghanistan online. So you'll find that we use very select language about how we refer to our work in Afghanistan online, because we don't want to put at risk any of our staff or survivors there. Within a couple of months, and this is perhaps to the comment of hope that you mentioned, Cindy, at the start, amazingly, our team managed to be one of the first organisations to actually have a written agreement with the Taliban to continue our work, which we believe there has to be God's miracle in that, because you can see I'm still shaking my head, just amazed that this is something that we've been able to bring about. It certainly feels like it's beyond just human achievement. And that enabled us to, with a very different lens, continue our work supporting survivors. So we couldn't continue delivering our economic empowerment for women program. Our work became very much an emergency response from August through until the second quarter of this year, through what was a very harsh winter. And we provided food packages, winter relief packages of blankets, in some instances clothing. We also provided safe spaces for children. So the IDP camps that popped up throughout Kabul very quickly in August, there were tens of thousands of families who had fled to Kabul looking for safety, where there was significant violence in the regions, and a lot of them arrived with nothing, started to face a harsh winter, and we were supporting survivors who were walking through the snow in thongs, living under a tarpaulin, so the typical types of conditions you would expect in an IDP type camp.
Merewyn, remind everyone what an IDP.
Sorry, thank you for that prompt. So internally displaced persons, so people who have left their home, left all of their belongings, to the extent that even when there appeared relative stability in the month or two after having fled to Kabul, they had no means to be able to actually even pay for the transport to return to their homes in the regions, and they weren't sure whether the homes they'd fled would have been destroyed and damaged. So We provided emergency food packages for families of up to 8 every month for across the winter period, just to help to sustain people. And it was that support where at that time where ACRATH members stepped in and supported that work that we were doing, and we're incredibly grateful, because without the support of partners across the globe, we couldn't have done that. We've come off the back of that emergency relief support and recognise that, and our team on the ground are the most amazing individuals who themselves are facing some incredibly challenging circumstances in their own families, and yet they still present each day to want to make a difference in their community. And they've identified the need to support, where we're able, people to be actually able to earn a livelihood to get back onto their own 2 feet. There's a absolutely declining or rising cost of living and declining opportunities for income that's really creating some really challenging circumstances, a lot of malnutrition. We've got emergency medical, a team that is delivering some quite specific medical relief in the province that actually had experienced the earthquake only a handful of months ago. They were on the ground at the time that occurred, and they were the first respondents on the ground for medical relief until some of the UN agencies were able to get in. And they're reporting to us, they're seeing an awful lot of malnutrition amongst young children, and that is because of the rising cost of living. So amongst other complexities, but that's really contributing to the fact that there is limited food supplies and increasing cost and limited income that people have. So one of the really hopeful pieces of work that we are doing is called a Livelihoods Project. I received a message from our executive director only a couple of days ago with some pictures of a recently launched program with 30 women in one of the IDP camps who are being trained in tailoring skills. There was a launch of this with the support of the Taliban. So there were members of the Taliban there at the launch, which still just amazes me because of some of the communication we hear about how some women are treated and how large communities of women are treated. We are certainly still seeing pockets of hope. And this training program, women are being trained over a 6-month period, being supplied with equipment to be able to learn tailoring skills and being supported to be able to find access to markets for sale of the products that they are producing. Hence, particularly doing this type of work through women means that we're also then feeding into the positive reinforcement of the role that women play in relationships and in community, because we know that domestic violence is something that's certainly increased as women are further repressed. So enabling them to play a meaningful role in the community, in their home, in their household, we've got evidence that makes a big difference. And that's also providing an opportunity for us to have meaningful conversations, to do 2 things with those women. One is to raise awareness about their rights in an appropriate, respectful way, but some of their most basic rights they're not aware of. But also to provide, where needed, trauma counselling for women with some of the experiences that they have had in a discreet and an environment that is actually where they are supported being in that environment. So that's some of the glimmers of hope that I think it's important to hold on to in some pretty challenging circumstances.
Merewyn, I don't know, like the Taliban, like I find you've mentioned it twice in really positive and possible sort of, ways. You mentioned before that the Afghan nationals are key to your work. Would you say that's an aspect of why it's working closely with the Taliban? Oh, well, yeah, I'll say closely or in partnership. Yeah. Can you nut out how that's happening? Because that to me is the best of human beings and potentially the not so best. So tell us about how that's working, or how did it evolve even?
Look, I absolutely take my hat off to our team in Kabul. I've had the absolute delight of meeting the acting executive director recently in Singapore when we got together for a global meeting, and just hearing from him directly about some of the challenges he's faced to achieve what the team has achieved. I mean, there are times, I'm naturally a positive person, so I like to be able to share where there is hope, because I think it's important. Otherwise, if we don't have a sense of hope, we need a sense of hope to want to continue to be passionate, to continue slogging the hard efforts to make a difference. But my colleague Rahula was telling me there are times he's attended a meeting and sat for 8 hours in Taliban offices before he was allowed to actually be seen and to advocate for what he was trying to advocate for. There have been month upon month upon month where staff have advocated for, in fact, up to almost the entire 12 months to advocate for us to be able to continue operation of some of our shelters. So there's actually another shelter that I can't talk of in too much detail, that it's taken 12 months of advocacy to actually get support from the Taliban to be able to continue delivering the services to some very vulnerable young girls. So there is real persistence, I think, and patience. What goes a long way is the fact that our staff are Afghan nationals, so they are representing their own culture in these conversations that they're having with the Taliban. But I genuinely believe there's also God's hand at work in all of this.
Yeah, thank you. And if this question is the question about the one you can't talk about, I'm happy if you don't go there. But when we were planning, you talked about a school for boys and girls that the Taliban came to you and said, can you do something with this bunch of kids? Is there something there you can tell us about that?
Yeah, so there's a crossover of the two shelters, one that I can't talk of in too much detail, but my observations are that I think as the Taliban have started to operate as the new government, there is a realisation that they actually need to be able to be collaborating in partnership to achieve outcomes, to enable a new economy to be developed and grown, and new government on all the various roles that go with that formed. And I think there's trust that our team have been able to develop with the Taliban that's meant that, yes, there were some child survivors of the violence that occurred at the airport in August last year, where there are a number of children who were found to be orphaned, for whether because of their parents being killed or their parents perhaps fleeing without them in the absolute chaos that occurred there. And I can understand how that occurred, because I know of a family just amongst our own staff who that occurred with, where someone then arrived in a location and realised amongst the chaos they'd been separated from their children. So there were children who were left behind needing support, and Hagar was asked to step in and fill that gap. And that includes, we are working with providing safe spaces for children, whether that be in the shelters or in these IDP camps, where we are enabled to actually, under the guise of providing a safe environment for children, we're actually able to provide educational support for them, and that has been endorsed by the Taliban. So that's some of the emergency relief support that we've received globally has included the provision of just some very basic stationery that's enabled children to feel that genuine connection to the school. Some of the support has also enabled some very basics, like there was a young girl who, through the harsh winter, had declared that she was going to not be able to continue to attend this safe space school, and it turned out to be because that she just didn't have clothing to be able to face walking through the harsh snow that she was facing. So we actually worked with her family to be able to provide sufficient clothing so that she could actually continue to actually attend this school. So sometimes some of the most basics that the children are facing has been where we've needed to step in and fill that gap to enable them to then continue with what we feel is really critical and important for them in an ongoing education.
Merewyn, it's powerful, your work. And to be me sitting in a middle-class suburb and hearing that, like, I feel as if, you're able to take us to a part of the world that we need to know about. And at the moment, really, there isn't a lot of news at the moment about Afghanistan. There's it was about the Queen last week, and it was about something else this week, and all news that we need to know about, I guess. But this is about human beings. You mentioned the boys and their families. Are you able to tell us, we often don't think of, well, we might think of boys, but I don't often think of boys in a trafficking situation. Are you able to tell us about the experience of trafficking in the case of these boys and the work? Because I love the concept of the healing, the thriving, the protecting, and the leading into the next stages of their lives. So are you able to help us understand the boys and their experience in the way, I was going to say ACRATH, Hagar works?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is a part of the work that we do that I found quite shocking to learn about this need that existed. So one of the practices that is accepted culturally within some tribal and Taliban components in Afghanistan is a practice called bachabazi, which is interpreted as the dancing boys. So they are young boys, 14, 15, 16, who are recruited by the Taliban to act as dancing entertainers, but effectively they are sex slaves. And perhaps one of what I've found one of the most challenging parts of learning about this practice is the fact that victims of this practice are then ostracised from their community. So even if they are able to escape this practice, they're not able to return to their home community, which just leaves them in such a vulnerable and difficult, doesn't even cut it as a word. So they become a number of the boys that we've supported through our Forgotten No More Boys shelter. A big piece of the work that we do with that cohort who we're supporting is the reintegration work. So a big part of it is healing, physical and emotional. But a big part of it is the exploring and supporting the opportunity for reconnection with their family. So there's one boy who we'd been working with in the last little while, and my colleagues had shared with me that they had been working to try and reintegrate him back into his family for 4 years. It took 4 years, but eventually, with an awful lot of support and educational support for those family members to understand the practice and that this isn't what their son had experienced was not reflective on him as a person and that he shouldn't carry that burden for life. But our staff were amazingly able to actually reintegrate him back into his family. And that, for me, when we talk about the whole journey, that's the real end goal of being able to enable someone, particularly young boys who've experienced the bachabazi practice, to actually be able to close that loop in terms of returning to the family that they were taken from or for some reason were disconnected from, and that led them into the practice. So
wow.
Yeah.
And it's transform, like your website talks about a transformational process like that. Who am I to say, but that does sound like something that is very transformational.
Yeah, and look, a lot of the stories that I hear are the survivors who share the stories themselves, or our staff who are able to share stories from survivors who are happy for their story to be shared. There is that real common theme of transformation, and I think that's only able to come about because of the long-term commitment. Hagar thinks very carefully before we take on a large volume of additional survivors because of our commitment to journey with them for as long as it takes. I mean, through the period of a couple of years ago in the height of COVID, we had survivors who had reached a stage of independence in Cambodia and Vietnam particularly, who were re-traumatized when they found themselves needing to be quarantined because of COVID, and reached out to Hagar, which we're incredibly grateful that they felt that we were part of their close network of support that they could reach out to. But we found ourselves needing to provide support and pivot, to use that overly used term, but we needed to pivot and provide the type of support to survivors who had otherwise reached a stage of independence and were being re-traumatized because of some of the experiences of lockdown and quarantine, job loss that came as a result of COVID. So when we say we walk the whole journey, it is very different in different contexts, because we really do want to reply or respond to what is occurring in each environment and what survivors in each of the environments we work in, what type of support they need.
Merewyn, the fact that people have responded, like reached out to you again, that you have high, regard in the communities and the countries. I like the idea, just very briefly, the other countries that you're engaged in, and you did say they are different. I know we've only got about 3 minutes left, but do you want to just share any other aspect of your, your work across other countries?
Yeah, thank you. Look, what we're finding in the last couple of years, and we're increasingly operating this way, is we're finding that it's really critical to work in the prevention space as well as the recovery space. So we're increasingly, while we're continuing, and the core part of our work will always be the recovery and support of survivors, we really want to actually work in the prevention space to reduce vulnerabilities of people falling victim to trafficking in the first place. So a large part of the work we're starting to do is really marrying up awareness and prevention raising programs, because a lot of the communities that we're in, there's often a lack of awareness about the risk factors that might lead people to be vulnerable to trafficking. And one of the biggest risk factors is often a lack of employment or lack of income. So in vulnerable communities, we're also working to marry prevention programs alongside of economic empowerment programs, where we're in communities where there is high risk. Often those awareness programs lead to identification of individuals who might be past victims who actually need support. So it's almost that triangular support of prevention, economic empowerment and recovery that is really becoming the pillars of the way that we are working in communities moving forwards.
Thank you. And one other thing, ACRATH's always up for a challenge. Like they're good at it. And anyone on our screen are good at sort of, I don't know how everyone's feeling, but what would you ask us to do, or how could we do something, whether it's an ACRATH call or whether it's an individual call? Is there anything, because you've given us hope, like in sort of, I don't know, how can we grow the hope, I guess?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So look, I guess I would say two things that could make a difference. So for us, we feel relatively small and not well known. So actually, if there's something that you've heard about our work, about the situation in Afghanistan, to actually choose to share that with some people in your network would be amazing. Whether it be sharing content that we might share on our Facebook or Instagram page. On our website, you can scroll down to the bottom of the homepage and you can register for our newsletters if you don't receive those already, just to stay in touch with our work that we're doing. But anyone who's listening to this, if there was a commitment made by each individual to share with at least 5-10 people in your network something that you might have heard today, then that would be fantastic. And anyone who is in a position to do so and wants to actually make a donation to the work we're doing in Afghanistan, you're able to actually go on our website on the donate page, and you can actually select Afghanistan particularly. So if you're really wanting to, or anyone in your networks you're talking to who wants to make a difference financially to contribute to some of the programs I've talked of, can do that.
Merewyn, I haven't really looked at the chat flow because I'm so interested in what you're saying, but a couple of them have popped up and it said how amazing it was. But I'll hand you over to Margot Shea because she'll close it off. But I'll chat to you in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
Hang on.
Oh, thanks, Cindy, and thanks, Merewyn. Sorry, I'm just on my tiny little iPad in a very unfamiliar place, so I hope this comes through. Merewyn, thank you so much. That was just inspirational, and congratulations on the great work that you do, and thanks for sharing it with us. You talked about pockets of hope, and really what we hear from Afghanistan is really quite the contrary. So it was wonderful to hear that, and to hear of the projects that you do with the Forgotten Boys and the work with the women. As Cindy said, we're sitting in our comfortable middle class backgrounds complaining often about the things that we have to do. And then we hear of what you're doing in the transformational process. So thank you so much for the work that you do. you're right that it's God's miracle that you're able to collaborate with the Taliban, and many blessings on your work, and may it continue.